On Mother's Day, my husband stood up in front of both our families, raised his glass, and said I didn't deserve to be celebrated, not even as a mother, and the worst part wasn't his voice. It was the quiet agreement around the table, the small nods, the soft hum of approval, like I had just been exposed for something I didn't even understand. And I remember sitting there with my hands wrapped around a glass of water, feeling the cold against my fingers, realizing in that exact moment that everything I thought I had built in that family meant nothing. But what they didn't know was that I had already made a decision earlier that day, and what happened that night would change every single one of their lives, including mine, forever. And before I take you back to where all of this really began, if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city, because I always read those, and it reminds me I'm not alone. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this was the night I quietly walked away from my marriage and my entire life without anyone at that table realizing it. But to understand how it got to that point, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when I still believed that love meant staying no matter what. When I still believed that if I gave enough, sacrificed enough, kept everything running smoothly, it would eventually be enough for them, for him, for all of them. And maybe that was my first mistake, because for years, I had been the one waking up before sunrise, packing lunches, getting our son ready for school, answering emails on my phone while standing in the kitchen with coffee going cold in my hand, while Daniel built his business, while his family praised him at every dinner, every holiday, every gathering, and I stayed in the background, making sure everything worked, making sure no one noticed what I was carrying. And I didn't complain, not once, not even when his mother would make those small comments, the kind that sound harmless if you're not listening closely. Things like, Daniel has always been the one with ambition, or it's good Rachel can focus on the home, that suits her, and I would smile, nod, keep the conversation moving, because I told myself it didn't matter. Because I believed that what I was doing mattered even if no one said it out loud. But slowly, over time, something started to shift, something I couldn't quite explain at first. The way Daniel stopped asking about my day, the way decisions were made without me, the way I became less of a partner and more of a background detail in my own life. And I remember one night, standing in the hallway outside our bedroom, hearing him on the phone with a colleague, laughing, confident, talking about his success, his sacrifices, and not once mentioning the years I had spent holding everything together so he could get there. And I didn't say anything. I just stood there, hand on the wall, feeling something inside me go quiet, not break, not yet, just quiet. And then there were the dinners, the family gatherings where everything was polished on the surface, where his mother would host these perfectly set tables with candles and wine glasses and soft music playing, and I would help serve, help clean, move in and out of conversations without really being part of them. And I started noticing the looks, the subtle glances, the way his sister Lily would tilt her head slightly when I spoke, like she was evaluating whether what I said was worth hearing. And I began to realize something uncomfortable, something I didn't want to admit, that in their eyes, I wasn't really part of the success they celebrated. I was just there, and still I stayed, because I thought that's what you do. You stay, you support, you keep things together. You don't make it about yourself, especially not when there's a child involved, especially not when leaving feels bigger than staying. But there was one detail, one small thing that didn't fit, something that would only make sense later, something I didn't fully understand at the time, and that was the email I received that morning, just hours before that Mother's Day dinner, an email I read twice, then a third time, my hand hovering over my phone, my heart beating a little faster, because it wasn't just a message, it was an opportunity, a shift, a door opening in a way I hadn't expected. And I remember sitting at the kitchen counter, sunlight coming through the window, our son upstairs getting ready, and thinking, what if I didn't stay this time? But I didn't answer that question yet. I just closed my phone, got dressed, helped my son with his shoes, and drove to that dinner like I had done so many times before, except something inside me was different, quieter, more certain. And as I walked into that house, hearing voices, laughter, the familiar rhythm of their world, I knew something was about to change. I just didn't know exactly how far it would go, or how quickly everything I had accepted for years would unravel in a single evening, starting with one sentence that I will never forget. When I walked into Daniel's parents' house that evening, everything looked exactly the way it always did. Warm lights, a perfectly set dining table, candles already lit even though the sun had not fully set yet, and the faint smell of roasted chicken and garlic bread filling the air. The kind of scene that from the outside would look like a happy family gathering. And for a second, standing there by the doorway with my purse still on my shoulder, I almost convinced myself that maybe I had overthought everything earlier that day. Maybe the email did not mean what I thought it meant. Maybe I was just tired. But then Margaret looked at me, gave me that polite smile that never quite reached her eyes, and said, "Rachel, you are late." Even though I was exactly on time, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest again, the kind that had become so normal, I barely questioned it anymore, so I nodded, apologized softly, and stepped inside, taking off my coat, placing it neatly over the back of a chair like I always did, moving through the space like someone who knew exactly where she belonged, even if no one else saw it that way. And Daniel was already there, standing near the kitchen island, talking to his father about something work-related, his voice steady, confident, and when he saw me, he did not walk over, did not ask how I was. He just gave me a quick glance and a small nod, like acknowledging a presence rather than greeting a partner. And I felt it again, that quiet shift inside me, not pain exactly, but something colder, something clearer. And I moved toward the dining table, helping set the last few plates, adjusting the silverware so everything lined up perfectly, because that was what I did. I made things look right even when they were not. And Lily was already seated, scrolling through her phone, and when I sat down across from her, she glanced up for half a second and said, "Nice dress," in a tone that made it impossible to tell if it was a compliment or something else, and I just smiled, said thank you, and folded my hands in my lap, waiting for dinner to start. And as everyone gathered around the table, the conversations began. Overlapping voices, small laughs, Daniel's father telling a story about a business deal, Margaret chiming in about how proud she was of Daniel, and I noticed, like I always did, how naturally everything circled back to him, his achievements, his work, his future, and I sat there, listening, nodding at the right moments, adding a small comment here and there when it felt appropriate, but mostly just observing. And then Margaret raised her glass, tapping it lightly with a spoon, and the room slowly quieted, the kind of silence that comes with expectation, and she smiled, looking around the table, and said, "Well, today is a special day," and everyone nodded, some murmuring agreement, and she continued, talking about family, about appreciation, about how important it is to recognize the people who truly contribute, and something about the way she said that word, contribute, made my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of my napkin, but I kept my expression calm, and then she turned her gaze to Daniel, her smile widening, and said, "I think we can all agree that Daniel has been the backbone of this family." And there were immediate nods, small sounds of agreement, and Daniel gave a modest smile, shaking his head slightly like he was embarrassed, but not really. And I felt the air in the room shift just enough for me to notice, just enough for something inside me to go still. And then Daniel picked up his glass, stood up slowly, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something kind, something balanced, something that acknowledged both of us. But instead, he looked directly at me, his expression calm, almost casual, and said, "If we are being honest, Rachel has never really contributed the way a mother should." And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The words did not fully register, like they had not landed yet. And then I saw Lily's lips pressed together in a small smile, Margaret's eyes lowering slightly in that way. She did when she agreed with something but did not want to appear too harsh, and Daniel continued, his voice steady. "She is here, yes. But being present is not the same as being valuable." And that was when the room went completely quiet, not shocked, not confused, just still, like everyone was waiting to see how I would respond. And I could feel my heartbeat slow down instead of speed up, which surprised me, my hands resting lightly on the table, the cool surface grounding me. And I realized something in that moment that I had not fully understood before, that this was not sudden. This was not a one-time comment. This was the result of years of small dismissals, quiet exclusions, subtle redefinitions of my role, until I had become almost invisible in the narrative of our own family, and I looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes for a brief second, and what I saw was not hostility, not even cruelty, just agreement. Quiet, unquestioned agreement, and something inside me settled into place, something calm, something final, and I smiled, just slightly, the kind of smile that did not reach my eyes, and I nodded once, as if I accepted what he had said, and that was the moment everything changed, even though no one else at that table realized it yet. For a few seconds after I nodded, no one spoke, and then the room seemed to exhale all at once, like a tension had been released, and conversation slowly picked back up, as if nothing unusual had just happened. Forks clinked lightly against plates. Someone poured more wine. Lily leaned back in her chair and checked her phone again, and Daniel sat down like he had just said something completely reasonable, something expected. And I noticed how easily the moment was absorbed, how quickly it became normal, and that told me everything I needed to know. So I picked up my fork, took a small bite of food I could barely taste, and kept my expression steady, calm, almost pleasant, because reacting would have meant I still needed their approval. And in that moment, I realized I did not, and that realization did not come with anger or sadness. It came with a strange kind of clarity, like stepping outside into cold air after being in a crowded room for too long. And as the dinner continued, I watched them more carefully than I ever had before. Daniel laughing at something his father said, Margaret correcting the placement of a serving dish, Lily making a quiet comment about a friend's new house, and I saw it all from a distance, like I was no longer inside the scene but observing it. And I noticed the patterns, the roles, the way everything revolved around maintaining a certain image, a certain hierarchy, and I understood then that I had been holding that structure together without ever being acknowledged as part of it, and once I saw that clearly, I could not unsee it, and there was a moment, small but important, when Daniel reached for the breadbasket and did not even glance in my direction, not even out of habit, and that was when something final settled inside me, not a decision made in anger, but one made in complete calm. And I remember thinking, I am done asking to be seen, and that thought felt heavier than anything he had said earlier, because it meant I was no longer waiting for things to change, and I continued eating slowly, listening to the conversation, without really participating, responding when spoken to, keeping everything smooth, because that was what I had always done. But now it felt different. Now it felt like I was closing something rather than maintaining it. And at one point, Margaret looked at me and said, Rachel, you have been very quiet tonight. And I smiled, met her eyes briefly, and said, I am just listening. And she nodded, satisfied, like that was exactly where I belonged. And the dinner stretched on for another hour, maybe longer. Time felt strange, slower in some moments, faster in others, and eventually, plates were cleared, dessert was served, small slices of cake arranged neatly on white plates, and I helped bring them out, placing each one carefully in front of everyone, moving around the table with the same quiet efficiency I had always had, and when I set Daniel's plate down, he did not look up, he just said thanks, in a distracted tone. And I nodded, even though he was not looking, and returned to my seat. And that was when I noticed Lily watching me for a second, longer than usual, her expression slightly curious, like she sensed something was different but could not quite identify it, and I held her gaze for just a moment before looking away, not out of discomfort, but because there was nothing left to prove. And as dessert ended and people began to stand, stretching, gathering their things, talking about plans for the week ahead, I felt a quiet sense of completion, like a chapter had reached its natural end. And when Daniel's father asked if we would be staying a bit longer, Daniel answered for both of us, saying we had an early morning, and I nodded in agreement because it no longer mattered, and we said our goodbyes. Polite? Expected. Margaret hugging Daniel, giving me a brief light embrace that felt more like a formality than anything else, and Lily waving as she walked back toward the living room, already focused on something else. And then we were outside, the night air cooler than I expected, the sky dark, the street quiet, and we walked to the car in silence, Daniel unlocking it, getting into the driver's seat, and I sat beside him, closing the door gently, the sound of it echoing slightly in the stillness. And for a moment, neither of us spoke. The engine started, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we pulled away from the house, and I looked out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, houses with lights still on, people moving inside their own lives, and I felt something shift again, deeper this time. Not just a decision, but an action waiting to happen. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice casual, like nothing significant had happened. "You were quiet tonight." And I turned my head slightly, looking at him, noticing the way his hands rested on the steering wheel, relaxed, certain, and I said, "I was thinking," and he nodded once, not asking what about, not really interested. And that was when I knew he would not see it coming. Not tonight, not even tomorrow, because in his mind, everything was exactly as it should be. And what he did not know, what none of them knew, was that while they were all agreeing about my worth at that table, I had already taken the first step toward a life where their opinions would no longer define anything about me. And that night, when we pulled into the driveway and the house came into view, quiet and still, I felt no hesitation as I reached for the door handle, because for the first time in years, I was not walking back into my life. I was walking out of it. The house was quiet when we walked in. The kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful but now felt hollow, like something had already been removed from it even before I did anything. And Daniel dropped his keys into the bowl by the door without looking at me, the small metallic sound echoing briefly before fading, and he walked straight toward the kitchen, opening the fridge like it was any other night, like the conversation at dinner had not happened, like nothing needed to be addressed. And I stood there for a moment in the entryway, my hand still resting on my purse strap, taking in the space that had once felt like home, noticing small things I had stopped seeing over the years. The picture frames on the wall slightly tilted, the shoes by the door that I always lined up neatly, the faint hum of the refrigerator. And I realized how much of this life had been maintained by quiet, invisible effort that had never been named, never been valued. And I slowly set my purse down on the table, the movement deliberate, controlled, not rushed, because there was no urgency, only certainty. And I walked into the living room, turning on a lamp, the soft light filling the space, and I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands resting on my knees, just breathing for a moment, not overwhelmed, not emotional, just present. And Daniel's voice drifted in from the kitchen, casual, almost distracted. "Do you want anything to drink?" And I paused before answering, "No," my voice calm, steady. And there was a short silence after that, like even that small exchange carried something unspoken, and then he said, "All right." And I heard the sound of a cabinet closing, and for a second, I thought about how easy it would be to continue like this, to go through the motions, to wake up tomorrow and pretend that tonight had not changed anything, because that was what I had always done, adjusted, absorbed, moved forward, but something inside me had already crossed a line, and I could not go back to not seeing it. And I stood up slowly, walking toward the hallway, each step quiet against the floor, and I entered our bedroom, closing the door gently behind me, not fully, just enough to create a small separation. And the room looked exactly as it always did, the bed neatly made, the nightstand organized, my side and his side clearly defined. And I walked to the closet, sliding the door open, the familiar rows of clothes hanging in place, everything arranged in a way that reflected years of routine. And I reached for a suitcase on the top shelf, pulling it down carefully, the weight of it familiar in my hands, and I placed it on the bed, unzipping it slowly, the sound quiet but sharp in the stillness of the room. And for a moment, I just stood there, looking at it, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the significance of what I was about to do. And then I began to pack, methodical, precise, choosing only what I needed, a few sets of clothes, essential items, documents I had already gathered earlier that day, placing them neatly inside, not rushing, not hesitating. And there was a strange calm in the process, like everything had already been decided long before this moment. And as I moved through the room, I noticed small details that felt different now. The framed photo of our wedding day on the dresser, both of us smiling, looking at each other like we believed in something that no longer existed. And I picked it up for a second, studying it, not with sadness, but with a kind of distance, like looking at a memory that belonged to someone else. And I set it back down exactly where it had been, and I continued packing, and then I walked to the nightstand, opening the drawer, taking out a small envelope I had placed there earlier, the one that contained copies of documents, confirmations, things I had prepared quietly without anyone noticing, and I slipped it into the suitcase, closing the zipper halfway, and I could hear Daniel moving around in the kitchen, the faint sound of the television turning on, a sports channel playing in the background, the normal rhythm of his evening, and it struck me how separate our worlds had become even while living under the same roof. And I stepped out of the bedroom briefly, walking down the hall to check on our son, his door slightly open, the soft glow of a nightlight illuminating the room, and I stood there for a moment, watching him sleep, his breathing steady, peaceful, unaware of everything that had shifted that night, and my chest tightened slightly, not with doubt, but with the weight of responsibility, and I whispered softly, "I have got you," even though he could not hear me, and I knew that whatever came next, I would make sure he was safe, stable, cared for in a way that did not depend on anyone else's approval. And I closed his door gently, returning to the bedroom, finishing the last of the packing, and when I zipped the suitcase fully, the sound felt final, like a line being drawn, and I stood there for a second, my hand resting on the handle, and I looked around the room one last time, not searching for reasons to stay, but acknowledging that I was leaving, and then I reached for my ring, sliding it off my finger slowly, the familiar pressure easing as it came free, and I placed it on the nightstand, right beside the lamp, where he would see it, not as a statement, not as a message, just as a fact. And I picked up the suitcase, the weight of it grounding, and I walked toward the door, my steps steady, my breathing even. And as I moved down the hallway, past the living room where Daniel sat watching television, unaware, I did not stop. I did not explain. I did not look back, because there was nothing left to say, and as I reached the front door, my hand on the handle, I felt it again, that same clarity from earlier, stronger now, undeniable, and I opened the door quietly, stepping out into the night, closing it behind me with a soft click that marked the end of everything they thought they knew about me, and the beginning of everything they never saw coming. I stepped onto the driveway, and the cool night air hit my face in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, like I had not really been outside in a long time, even though I had every day, and for a moment I just stood there with the suitcase in my hand, listening to the quiet, no voices, no expectations, no one watching me, and it felt different, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just still. And I walked to my car, placed the suitcase in the trunk, closed it gently, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine right away, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my reflection faint in the dark windshield, and I took a slow breath, realizing that for the first time in years, there was no one inside that house waiting for me to come back in, no role I had to step back into, no version of myself I had to perform. And that thought did not scare me. It grounded me, and I reached for my phone, unlocking it, opening the email again, reading it one more time just to be sure, the subject line still simple, direct, but carrying more weight than anything I had heard at that dinner table, and I could feel my heartbeat steady, not racing, not anxious, just clear. And I started the car, the engine coming to life quietly, and as I pulled out of the driveway, I did not look back, not because I was trying to be strong, but because there was nothing behind me that needed another look, and the streets were nearly empty, a few cars passing by, streetlights stretching in long lines ahead of me, and I drove without turning on the radio, without filling the silence, letting my thoughts move at their own pace. And for a while, I did not think about Daniel or his family. I thought about the years, the small moments that had added up to this, the early mornings, the late nights, the constant balancing of everything that had never been named as valuable, and I realized how easily I had accepted being unseen, not because I believed I had no worth, but because I believed that eventually, if I stayed consistent enough, if I kept showing up, it would be recognized, and that belief had kept me in place far longer than anything else. And I tightened my grip on the steering wheel slightly, not out of anger, but out of recognition. And I said quietly to myself, "Not anymore." And the words felt simple, but final. And after about 20 minutes of driving, I reached the small apartment building I had visited earlier that week, the one I had not told anyone about, not even in passing, because some decisions needed space to exist before they were questioned, and I parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second, looking up at the building, a few windows lit, Others dark, ordinary, nothing impressive, but it felt like something I had chosen for myself, and that alone made it different. And I got out of the car, took the suitcase from the trunk, and walked toward the entrance, the sound of my footsteps quiet against the pavement. And when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the hallway light flickered slightly before stabilizing, and I walked up the short set of stairs to the second floor, stopping in front of the unit I had signed for earlier that day, the key already in my hand. And I paused for just a moment before unlocking it, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that once I stepped inside, there would be no going back to the version of my life I had just left. And then I turned the key, opened the door, and stepped in, and the space was empty except for the basic furniture that came with the lease, a small couch, a table, a bed in the corner, nothing personal yet, nothing filled in, but it felt open, like something that could become whatever I decided. And I set the suitcase down by the door, walking slowly into the room, running my fingers lightly along the edge of the table, taking in the quiet, and I realized something then that I had not fully allowed myself to feel before, that leaving had not created emptiness, it had created space. And that space was not something to fear, it was something to build from, and I sat down on the couch, leaning back slightly, exhaling in a way that felt deeper than before. And I looked at my phone again, noticing the time, just past 10:30, and I knew that back at the house, Daniel was probably still sitting in the living room, the television on, assuming I was somewhere in the bedroom, assuming everything was normal, and that thought did not bring satisfaction or guilt. It just confirmed what I already knew, that he had never really seen me clearly enough to notice the shift when it happened. And I placed my phone on the table, letting the silence settle around me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to feel something more than clarity, a quiet sense of relief, not loud, not overwhelming, just steady, like a weight I had been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down. And I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, looking at the empty room, and I thought about what would come next, the conversations that would happen, the questions, the reactions, because I knew they would come, not immediately, but soon, and when they did, they would not understand. Not at first, because from their perspective, nothing had been wrong enough to justify this. Nothing had been dramatic enough to explain why I had walked away without a word. But what they did not understand, what they had never understood, was that it was never about one moment. It was about all of them. Every small dismissal, every quiet agreement, every time I had been reduced to something less than what I was. And as I sat there in that quiet apartment, I knew that when they finally realized I was gone, when Daniel walked into that bedroom and saw the ring on the nightstand, when he noticed the empty space where my things had been, when he understood that I was not coming back, that would be the moment everything shifted for them, just like it had already shifted for me. And what happened after that, the way they reacted, the way he tried to respond, was something they were not prepared for, because they still believed they understood the role I played in their lives, and they had no idea how much of it had already been taken away. I did not sleep much that night, not because my mind was racing, but because everything felt too still, like I had stepped into a space where my thoughts no longer needed to compete with anything else, and I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the building, the occasional sound of a car passing outside, and I realized how long it had been since I had experienced silence without tension attached to it. And sometime around 3 a.m, I finally closed my eyes, not fully resting, but enough to let my body settle. And when I woke up, the sunlight coming through the thin curtains was soft, unfamiliar in this new space. And for a second, I had to remind myself where I was, not in confusion, but in recognition of how much had changed in such a short time. And I sat up slowly, my feet touching the cool floor, and I looked around the apartment again, the emptiness no longer feeling uncertain but intentional, like a clean page. And I reached for my phone on the table, the screen lighting up immediately. And that was when I saw it. Multiple missed calls, several messages, all from Daniel, the timestamps stretching back over the past few hours. And I stared at the screen for a moment, not opening them right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because I wanted to choose when to step into that part of the reality. And I set the phone down again, standing up, walking to the small kitchen area, filling a glass of water, taking a slow sip, grounding myself before anything else. And then I picked up the phone again, unlocking it, opening the messages, and the first one was simple. "Where are you?" Sent at 11:12 p.m. Then another. "Rachel." Then, "Why is your ring on the nightstand?" And I paused there, my thumb hovering over the screen, and I could almost see the moment he walked into the bedroom, the moment he noticed what I had left behind. And I continued reading, the messages becoming more frequent, less controlled. "This is not funny. Call me. Where did you go?" And then the tone shifted slightly. "Did something happen?" And finally, a missed call from Margaret, followed by one from Lily, and I exhaled slowly, not with frustration, not with satisfaction, just with understanding. This was the moment I had anticipated, the moment when the absence I had created began to take shape for them, and I locked the phone again, placing it back on the table, not responding yet, because I knew that whatever I said needed to come from the same clarity that had guided me the night before, not from reaction, not from emotion, and I moved through the morning slowly, taking a shower, getting dressed, choosing simple clothes, nothing that felt like I was trying to prove anything, just something comfortable, something that belonged to me. And as I stood in front of the small mirror, brushing my hair, I looked at my reflection, really looked, not the version of myself that had been filtered through their expectations, but the person standing there. And I noticed something subtle but real. My shoulders were not tense, my expression was not guarded, and I felt present in a way I had not in a long time, and I nodded slightly to myself, not as encouragement, but as acknowledgement. And when I finally picked up my phone again, it buzzed almost immediately, Daniel calling again, and I watched the screen for a second before answering, pressing the button and bringing it to my ear. "Hello?" My voice steady, and there was a brief silence on the other end, like he had not expected me to actually pick up, and then his voice came through, sharper than usual, edged with something I had not heard from him before. "Where are you?" And I leaned lightly against the counter, my fingers resting on the edge, and I said, "I am safe," not giving more than that, and he exhaled, a mix of relief and irritation. "That is not what I asked. Rachel, where did you go? What is this?" And I let a small pause settle between us before responding, not to create tension, but to make sure I was speaking from the right place. I left, and there was another silence, heavier this time, and then he said, "Left where, for how long?" And I closed my eyes briefly, not out of exhaustion, but to center myself, and I said, "I am not coming back," and the words landed differently than anything I had said before, not raised, not emotional, just clear, and on the other end, I could hear him shift, the sound of movement, like he was standing up, trying to process what I had just said. "What are you talking about? You do not just leave. We have a house, we have a child. You cannot just disappear like this." And I listened to him, really listened, and I noticed something important. He was not asking why I left. He was questioning how I could, and that told me everything about how he saw the situation. And I said quietly, "I did not disappear, I made a decision," and he let out a short laugh, not amused but dismissive. "Because of what? One dinner, one comment, you are going to throw everything away." And I felt that familiar clarity return, stronger now, and I answered, "It was not one dinner." And I let that sit, not explaining further, not listing everything, because I did not need to convince him. And there was a longer pause this time, and then his voice changed slightly, less sharp, more controlled. "Rachel, come home. We can talk about this. Whatever you think happened, we can fix it." And I opened my eyes, looking out the small window of the apartment, the light steady, the world outside moving like any other day. And I said, "I am not coming back to fix something that was never seen as broken." And the silence that followed was different, not confusion, not irritation, but something closer to realization. And I knew in that moment that this was where everything truly began for him. Not the dinner, not the empty bedroom, but this conversation, where he started to understand that I was no longer playing the role he expected, and what he did next, the way he tried to respond, the way his family would eventually step in, was something none of them had prepared for, because they still believed I would return to the version of myself they understood, and they had no idea that version no longer existed. The apartment stayed quiet after the call ended, but it was no longer the same quiet as before. Now it carried a sense of movement, like something unseen was shifting beneath the surface, and I could feel it even without looking at my phone, the weight of what I had set in motion beginning to ripple outward, and I walked slowly across the room, stopping near the window, watching the street below as people moved through their morning routines, coffee cups in hand, cars pulling in and out, lives continuing without interruption, and for a moment, it grounded me, reminding me that the world did not stop just because my life had changed. And then my phone buzzed again, this time a message, not from Daniel, not from Margaret, but from Lily, and I hesitated for a second before opening it, her words short, direct, "This is getting out of control, call me." And I read it twice, noticing the phrasing, not concern, not confusion, but control, like she believed this was something that needed to be corrected quickly before it became something bigger. And I set the phone down without replying, not out of avoidance, but because I understood something now that I had not fully understood before, that every conversation from this point forward would be an attempt to pull me back into a version of reality that no longer fit, and I needed to stay clear, steady, not reactive. And I moved back to the couch, sitting down, leaning forward slightly with my elbows resting on my knees, letting my thoughts settle. And I thought about the email again, the one that had started this shift before the dinner even happened, the one I had read sitting at my kitchen counter that morning, and I reached for my laptop on the small table, opening it, the screen lighting up as I logged in, navigating back to the message, reading it once more, slower this time, taking in every detail, every word, and I felt that same quiet certainty return, stronger now, because this was not just about leaving something behind. It was about stepping into something that had been waiting for me long before I allowed myself to see it, and I closed the laptop gently, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, and that was when my phone rang again, Daniel's name on the screen, and I watched it for a few seconds, noticing how different it felt now, not urgent, not overwhelming, just another choice. And I answered, bringing it to my ear, "Yes." And there was no greeting on his end this time, just his voice, tighter, more controlled. "I have been thinking," and I leaned back slightly against the couch, my posture relaxed, and I said, "Okay," giving him space to continue. And he did, his tone measured, like he was trying to regain control of the situation. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be. What I said last night, it was not meant the way you are taking it." And I listened carefully, not interrupting, because this part mattered, not for him, but for me. And he continued, "We can fix this. You come home, we talk, we move forward. That is what people do." And I let a small pause settle before responding, not to create tension, but to make sure my words came from clarity. "That is what I have been doing for years." And he exhaled sharply, frustration slipping through now. "Rachel, do not twist this. You are acting like I have done something unforgivable." And I closed my eyes briefly, letting that statement pass through without reacting to it emotionally. And I said, "I am not acting, I am responding." And there was a silence on the line, heavier this time, and I could almost hear him recalibrating, trying a different approach. And then he said, "What do you want?" And that question landed differently, not because it was new, but because it was the first time he had asked it in a way that was not rhetorical. And I opened my eyes, looking at the room around me, the space I had chosen, the stillness I had created, and I said, "I want to be in a place where I am not questioned for existing." And he did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was quieter, less certain. "That is not fair." And I almost smiled, not out of humor, but because I understood that fairness had never really been part of the equation before, not in the way he was thinking of it now. And I said, "It is not about fair." And I let that sit, not explaining further, because I knew that no explanation would bridge the gap between how we saw things, and there was a longer silence this time. And then he said, more firmly, "You cannot just take our son and decide everything on your own." And I noticed the shift immediately, the focus moving from me to control, to structure, to what he believed he had a right to, and I responded calmly, "I have not taken him anywhere. He is safe, and I have made sure everything is in place." And that was when he paused. Really paused, because that was not something he expected. And he asked, slower now, "What does that mean?" And I leaned forward slightly, my fingers resting on the edge of the table, and I said, "It means I have already thought this through." And the weight of that statement settled between us, and I could feel it. The realization beginning to form on his side, that this was not impulsive, not emotional, not something that would fade overnight. And he let out a breath, quieter now, and said, "Rachel, we need to sit down and talk about this in person." And I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, and I said, "We can talk, but not to go back." And that was the line, clear, steady, and on the other end. There was silence again, but this time it was different. Not confusion, not frustration, but something closer to understanding. Not acceptance yet, but the beginning of it. And as I ended the call, placing the phone back on the table, I knew that this was the point where everything shifted for him as well. Because for the first time, he was no longer dealing with the version of me that adjusted, that stayed, that absorbed, and what he did next. How he chose to respond to that would determine everything that followed, because they still believed they could bring me back into their version of reality, and they had not yet realized that I had already stepped fully into my own. The rest of that morning moved with a kind of quiet precision, like every step I took had already been considered long before I actually made it. And I found myself organizing small things in the apartment, placing my suitcase by the wall, folding a few clothes, clearing the table even though there was nothing on it, just creating a sense of order in a space that was still unfamiliar. And I realized I was not doing it out of habit. I was doing it because for the first time, the space belonged entirely to me, and that changed the way even the smallest actions felt. And around noon, my phone buzzed again. But this time it was not a call or a message. It was a notification, an email. And I knew before opening it what it would be. And when I tapped the screen, I saw Daniel's name in the subject line. Short, direct, no greeting, just a single line that read, "We need to meet today." And I stared at it for a moment. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood that this was the next step, the moment where everything would move from distance to confrontation. And I closed the message without replying immediately, not avoiding it, just giving myself space to decide how I wanted to handle it. And I stood up, walking toward the window again, looking out at the street below, watching a woman walk past with a grocery bag, a child holding her hand. And I noticed how natural that looked, how simple, how unforced. And it made me think about the version of motherhood that had been questioned the night before, the version that had been reduced to something less than what it actually was. And I felt that same steady clarity rise again, not defensive, not reactive, just grounded. And I picked up my phone, opening the message, and typed back, "I can meet this afternoon," keeping it simple, neutral, and within minutes, his response came, 3 o'clock, the office. And I paused for a second when I read that, noticing the choice of location, not home, not somewhere neutral, but his office, a place where he was in control, where his identity was strongest. And I almost smiled, not because it bothered me, but because it confirmed something I already knew, that he was still approaching this from the same framework, the same structure where he set the terms. And I replied, "That works," and set the phone down again. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the reality of the upcoming conversation settle in. And I noticed something important. I was not nervous, not in the way I would have been before. There was no tightness in my chest, no racing thoughts, just a quiet awareness that this was a conversation I was ready for. And I moved through the afternoon preparing in small, practical ways, choosing what to wear, something simple, something that felt like me, not like a version of me designed to fit into someone else's expectations. And I gathered a few documents from my bag, placing them neatly into a folder, not as a defense, not as a weapon, but as clarity. And when I finally left the apartment, the air outside was warmer than it had been the night before, the sun higher, the streets busier, and I drove toward the office building where Daniel worked, the familiar route feeling different now, not because the streets had changed, but because I had. And as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how full it was, cars lined up in neat rows, people moving in and out of the building. And I sat in the car for a moment after turning off the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, taking a slow breath, not to calm myself, but to center myself. And then I stepped out, closing the door gently, walking toward the entrance with a steady pace. And when I stepped inside, the environment was exactly as I remembered. Polished floors, quiet conversations, the low hum of activity, and I walked to the elevator, pressing the button, waiting as the numbers above the door slowly counted down. And when it opened, I stepped in, pressing the floor number without hesitation. And as the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored panel. and I noticed something again, something subtle but real. I looked like myself, not the version shaped by someone else's expectations, and when the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into the hallway, the familiar layout stretching ahead, and I walked toward his office, each step steady, not rushed, not hesitant, and when I reached the door, it was already slightly open, and I could see him inside, standing near his desk, his posture straight, his expression focused, and for a brief moment, we looked at each other without speaking, and I noticed the difference immediately, the way he was looking at me now, not casually, not dismissively, but with a kind of attention that had not been there before, and I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, and the room felt different than it had in the past, not because anything had changed physically, but because the dynamic had shifted, and he gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." His voice controlled, and I sat down, placing my folder on my lap, my posture relaxed, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to acknowledge that this was not a normal conversation. And then he said, "I need to understand what you are doing." And I looked at him, meeting his gaze directly, and I said, "I am not doing anything to you. I am making a choice for myself." And he leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the desk, and I could see the tension in his expression now. Not anger, not yet, but something close to it. And he said, "You are walking away from everything, from your life, from your family." And I shook my head slightly, my voice calm, steady. "No, I am walking away from a version of it that does not include me." And that was when something shifted in his face, a small change, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me that for the first time, he was starting to hear what I was actually saying. And what happened next, the way he responded to that realization, would define everything that came after, because this was no longer about convincing me to come back. It was about understanding why I had left in the first place, and he was only just beginning to see that he had never really asked that question before. Daniel did not respond right away after I said that, and for a moment he just looked at me, really looked at me, like he was trying to reconcile the person sitting in front of him with the version he thought he knew, and I could see it in the way his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, like something was not aligning the way it was supposed to, and he leaned back in his chair slowly, his hands moving from the desk to rest in his lap, and he exhaled, longer this time, like he was trying to reset the conversation, and then he said, more carefully, "You are acting like you have been invisible in this family. That is not true." And I listened, not interrupting, because I wanted to hear exactly how he framed it, and he continued, "You have had everything you needed, the house, stability, support. I have made sure of that." And I nodded slightly, acknowledging what he believed without agreeing with it, and I said, "You have provided things, yes." And I let a small pause settle before adding, "But you have not seen me." And the distinction hung there between us, quiet but heavy, and he frowned slightly, like the sentence did not fully make sense to him. And he said, "That does not make sense. You are part of my life. You are part of this family." And I kept my voice even, not raising it, not pushing, just stating what had been true for a long time. Being present is not the same as being valued, and he shifted again, his posture tightening slightly. And I could see the frustration beginning to surface, not explosive, but controlled, like he was trying to keep the conversation within boundaries he understood. And he said, "So what? Now none of it counts. Everything we built, everything I have done, it just means nothing to you." And I shook my head gently, not dismissing his effort, but refusing the narrative he was trying to set. And I said, "It is not about what you did. It is about what was missing." And he looked at me for a second, longer this time, and I could see something flicker there. Not agreement, not yet, but awareness, like a part of him was starting to register that this was not an argument he could solve by listing accomplishments or responsibilities. And he leaned forward again, his elbows resting on the desk, his voice lower now, more focused. "Then explain it to me." And for a moment I considered it, not because I felt obligated to justify myself, but because I understood that this was the first time he had actually asked a question that pointed toward understanding instead of control. And I said, slowly, choosing my words carefully, "Do you remember the last time you asked me how I was? Not as a routine, not as a habit, but because you actually wanted to know. And he did not answer immediately, his expression tightening slightly as he searched for something to say, and I continued, "Do you remember the last time something I did was acknowledged without being compared to what you did?" And the silence grew, not uncomfortable, but revealing, and I added, "Do you remember the last time I was part of a conversation that was not about supporting you or fitting into your plans?" And he looked down briefly, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the desk, a small, almost unconscious movement, and I could see it then, the beginning of realization, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to shift something. And he said, quieter now, "That is not fair. I did not know you felt that way." And I nodded once, because that part was true, and I said, "I know," and that was the point. Not that he had intended to ignore me, but that he had never needed to see me differently, and I had allowed that to continue for longer than I should have. And he looked up again, meeting my eyes, and for the first time, there was no immediate argument, no quick correction, just a pause. And then he said, "So you leave," like he was still trying to fit the outcome to the explanation. And I said, "I chose to stop staying in something that did not include me." And the words felt steady, grounded, not dramatic, just true. And he leaned back again, running a hand through his hair, his movement slower now, less certain, and I could see the shift happening in real time, the structure he had relied on beginning to feel less stable. And he said, "And what do you expect me to do with that?" And I almost smiled, not out of humor, but because it was the first time he had framed the situation as something he needed to respond to rather than control. And I said, "That is not my responsibility anymore." And the statement landed differently than anything else I had said, because it removed something he had always assumed was there, my role in maintaining the balance, and he did not respond right away. And when he did, his voice was quieter, less defined. "We have a child." And I nodded, my expression softening slightly, not because I was uncertain, but because that part mattered in a different way. And I said, "And I have made sure he is taken care of." And he looked at me sharply at that, not aggressive, but alert, like he was trying to understand what that meant. And I could see the questions forming, the realization that there were things I had already set in place without his involvement. And that was when the dynamic shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed everything moving forward. Because for the first time, he was not the one setting the structure of what came next, and I was not the one adapting to it. And as the silence settled between us, I knew this was the moment where everything became real for him, not just the fact that I had left, but the understanding that I had done it with intention, with preparation, with clarity. And what he said next, the way he chose to respond to that realization, would define everything that came after, because he was no longer speaking to the version of me that stayed, and he had not yet fully understood what that meant. He stayed silent after that, longer than before, and I could see it now, not just confusion, not just frustration, but something deeper, something he was not used to feeling in a situation like this, uncertainty. And it showed in the way his posture shifted, the way his shoulders lowered slightly, as if the certainty he had walked into the room with was no longer holding in the same way. And he looked at me again, studying my face like he was trying to find something familiar, something he could recognize and use to guide the conversation back into a space he understood. But there was nothing there for him to anchor to anymore. And that was when he said, quieter than before, "You planned this." And it was not a question, not exactly, more like a realization forming out loud. And I nodded once, not dramatically, not defensively, just acknowledging the truth of it. And I said, "Yes," and that one word seemed to land heavier than anything else I had said, because it removed the last assumption he had been holding on to, that this was impulsive, emotional, temporary. And he leaned back again, his eyes shifting briefly toward the window behind me, like he needed a second to process that, and then he looked back at me, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Since when?" And I did not rush to answer, not because I was trying to create tension, but because I wanted to be honest without turning this into something reactive. And I said, "Since I realized I was the only one adjusting," and he frowned slightly, the line between his brows deepening, and I could see the resistance there, not to the words themselves, but to what they implied. And he said, "That is not how I see it." And I nodded again, because I expected that, and I said, "I know," And that was the difference. We were not arguing over facts. We were looking at the same reality through completely different lenses. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence settling between us again. But this time it was not tense. It was revealing, like everything that needed to be said was already there, just waiting to be understood. And then he said, more slowly, "So what happens now?" And that question was different from the others. It was not about pulling me back, not about correcting the situation. It was about what came next, and I could hear it in his tone. The shift from control to uncertainty, and I took a small breath before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to be clear. Now we figure out how to move forward without pretending this was working. And he looked at me for a second, longer this time, and I could see the weight of that settling in. Not fully accepted, not yet, but no longer dismissed, and he nodded slightly, almost to himself, and said, "You are serious." And I said, "I have never been more serious." And the room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not empty, not unresolved, but full of something that had not existed before. Acknowledgement, even if it was incomplete, and he stood up slowly from his chair, walking a few steps toward the window, his back partially turned to me, his hands resting on his hips. And I watched him, not analyzing, not judging, just observing. And I noticed the way his movements had changed, less certain, more deliberate, like he was no longer operating from instinct, but from thought. And after a few seconds, he spoke again, without turning around. "Do you think I did not care?" And the question caught me slightly off guard, not because of the words, but because of the tone. It was not defensive, not accusatory. It was searching, and I answered honestly, "I think you did not notice." And that distinction mattered. And he turned slightly at that, looking at me over his shoulder, his expression harder to read now. And he said, "There is a difference," and I nodded. "There is," and we held that for a moment, both understanding what it meant without needing to explain it further. And then he walked back to the desk, sitting down again, his posture more grounded now, less rigid, and he said, "And you think leaving fixes that?" And I shook my head gently. "No, leaving does not fix it." And I let a small pause settle before adding, "It stops it from continuing." And that was when something shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that changed the direction of the conversation. Because for the first time, there was no immediate response, no attempt to argue or reframe, just silence, and I could see it in his face, the realization that this was not about winning or losing, not about being right or wrong, but about something that had been overlooked for too long. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the desk before lifting again, and he said, "I did not see it," and the admission was quiet, almost understated. But it carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, and I nodded once, not as validation, but as acknowledgement, and I said, "I know." And that was the truth. I knew he had not seen it, but that did not change the impact of it, and we sat there for a moment, both still, both aware that the conversation had reached a point where things could no longer go back to what they were. And he leaned back in his chair again, his hands resting loosely in his lap, and he looked at me, not with certainty, not with control, but with something else, something unfamiliar, and he said, "Then what do you want from me now?" And this time, the question did not carry expectation, it carried openness, and I held his gaze for a second before answering, my voice calm, steady. "I want you to understand that I am not coming back to the same place I left." And that was the line, clear, final. And as the silence followed, I knew this was the moment everything truly settled into reality for both of us. Not just that I had left, but that I had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And what happened after this, the way we both moved forward from this point, would not be about returning to what was, but about deciding what could exist next, if anything at all. In the weeks that followed, everything became quieter, not in a way that felt empty, but in a way that felt intentional. Like each part of my life was finally allowed to exist without being measured against someone else's expectations, and the apartment that once felt unfamiliar slowly became a place where I could breathe without thinking about how I was being perceived, where mornings started without tension, where decisions were made without hesitation. And it was not perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, still nights where I lay awake thinking about everything that had changed. But even in those moments, there was something new underneath it all. a sense of steadiness I had not felt in years. And Daniel and I continued to talk, not every day, not in long conversations, but enough to handle what needed to be handled, especially when it came to our son. And those conversations were different now, more direct, more honest, without the layers of assumption that had once defined everything between us. And I could see it in him too, not a complete transformation, not something sudden, but a shift, a recognition of things he had not seen before. And whether that would lead to something new or simply closure, I no longer felt responsible for deciding that alone. And that was the difference. I was no longer carrying something that required me to disappear in order for it to function. And as time passed, I began to understand something that I had missed for a long time. That self-respect is not something you ask for. It is something you choose, quietly, consistently, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it changes everything around you. And I learned that boundaries are not punishments for other people. They are protections for yourself. And that staying in a situation where you are not seen does not make you strong. It slowly teaches you to accept less than what you deserve. And the hardest part is that it does not happen all at once. It happens in small moments, in things you overlook, in things you excuse, until one day you realize you have been standing in the background of your own life. And if you are listening to this, and something in this story feels familiar, if you have ever sat in a room where your presence was expected, but your voice was not, if you have ever questioned your own value because someone else failed to recognize it, I want you to know that you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not wrong for wanting more, for wanting to be seen, for wanting to exist in a space where you do not have to shrink to belong. And it does not mean you have to leave everything behind the way I did. Every situation is different, every life is different. But it does mean you have to start paying attention to what your instincts are telling you, because that quiet feeling you ignore, the one that tells you something is not right, it is not there by accident. It is there to guide you. And sometimes faith, whether you call it God, the universe, or something inside yourself, shows you the truth long before you are ready to act on it. And when that moment comes, when you finally see things clearly, you have a choice: to stay where it is comfortable but incomplete, or to step into something uncertain but real. And neither path is easy, but only one of them allows you to keep your sense of self intact. And if there is anything I would say from all of this, it is to protect that part of yourself, your clarity, your independence, your ability to stand in your own life without needing permission to exist in it, because once you lose that, everything else becomes harder to rebuild. And I am still learning, still adjusting, still figuring out what comes next. But I am doing it from a place that belongs to me. And that makes all the difference. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it made you pause or reflect, you can share where you are watching from or what time it is where you are, because I read those messages and they remind me that there are people out there going through their own versions of this. And if you choose to stay and listen to more stories like this, you are always welcome here. Thank you for being here, for taking the time to listen, for allowing this story to exist beyond just me. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is simple. Do not let anyone define your value by what they fail to see.